This is TWiT.
Well, chances are if you're listening to this, then you know a thing or two about podcasts. But something very exciting that's happened is that Google Podcasts is coming to, or is here, it's here for iOS. And so we are very excited to talk to the founder and product manager of Google Podcasts, Zack Reneau-Wedeen, who's here with us today. Hello, Zack.
Hey, Mikah. Thanks for having me on. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, we are so pumped about this. So, I'm a native iOS user. I've used loads of different podcast apps, and I'm curious, what is Google Podcasts bringing to the iOS experience? What is it that makes Google Podcasts unique? What can it do for me as an iOS user?
So, I guess yesterday we kind of have three parts of the launch. The first is a little bit less relevant to iOS because it's our first launch on iOS, and that is a redesign of the app around discovery. And we can talk a little bit more maybe in the coming minutes about the podcast discovery problem. Mm-hmm. The second thing that we've done is just add a bunch of features. So the ability to queue up podcasts, the ability to turn on auto downloading, view your listen history, set up push notifications. These are all things that Google Podcasts for Android didn't have until this week, which is rolling out. I think it'll probably roll out to 100% by tomorrow. And so those are kind of the first two parts of the launch. But the third part is that Google Podcasts is available on iPhone for the first time. And we started working on podcasts a few years ago. We first launched Google Podcasts for Android in 2018. So you might be wondering why it took us almost 2 more years to release an iPhone app. And the reason is that with the success that we saw in terms of growth and engagement in Google Podcasts for Android, we also saw a lot of people interested in listening to podcasts when they search on Google. We saw people listening to podcasts through the Google Assistant. And while there are 2 billion people around the world who have Android devices, and that's a massive opportunity, we also want to make sure that we're serving users who might have, let's say, a smart speaker like a Google Home, but also an iPhone. Mikah, I'm sure since you host a tech podcast, your iPhone is probably not your only device that you have. Is that a fair assumption?
That is an absolutely fair assumption as I look around and see all of these devices listening.
So for someone like you, you might listen to podcasts that are over an hour long. You might want to start one on your computer, pick up on your phone. You might be cooking dinner and you want to ask Google Assistant to play your podcast and pick up where you left off. And so, especially for podcasts, which can be such a rich, long form type of media, we want to make sure that any user, whether they're using Google for all of their devices or just for some of them, can use Google Podcasts. So that's a big part of it. The other part of it, honestly, is on the publisher side too. If you're going to have your podcast on Google Podcasts and you want to tell users where they can get it, you want to make sure that player is universally available. And we have a pretty strong belief. It's, one of the words in Google's mission is universal, making the world's information universally accessible and useful. And so we feel like podcasts are a universal medium the same way as radio. And so it's not just sort of tactical, it's also bubbles up to a higher level of strategy for podcasts, but also for Google as a company.
Excellent. Now, one of the first thing you mentioned in the article, and I was kind of reading along and going, yes. You say it took me a decade to find the podcasts I love most. And so one of the features that Google Podcasts is rolling out is a way that makes it easy for you to find shows that you will genuinely enjoy. And I'm curious, does this go down to the episode level? Is it a podcast as a whole kind of recommendation? And do you want to just talk about this feature in general and why you're so excited about it?
Yeah, so I mean, you can see from the blog post, this was kind of a fun blog post to write for me because it also allowed me to kind of take a trip down memory lane and think about what I was listening to 10 years ago, 5 years ago, when I think getting into podcasts was really required a different level of energy. but it still requires a lot more energy, I think, than getting into YouTube or Twitter or Instagram or these services that have really figured out discovery to a much greater degree than we have in podcasting. And so if you'd asked me 2 years ago when we first launched Google Podcasts on Android, I would sort of have to talk my way around the fact that we did show recommendations primarily based on what else you were listening to, which is great once you get into podcasts, because it says, oh, you listen to this, you might also like that. And those are good recommendations. But it doesn't address two things. The first one is that if you're not already into podcasts, there isn't necessarily a listening history with which to give you new recommendations. So it doesn't solve the cold start problem. And then the second thing is that when you operate at the show level, you actually miss out on a lot of relationships that could be formed between a listener and a podcaster. So to give you an example, there's a podcast that I used to listen to. I still listen to it sometimes, but it's called You Made It Weird with Pete Holmes. It's kind of like comedy, spirituality, culture, lifestyle, and he's very entertaining. He's a good host. And the reason that I got into that podcast is because he did an interview in particular with Aaron Rodgers, who's the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers. And I'm a sports fan. And so I was willing to dip a toe in and see, oh, who's this Pete Holmes guy? Because I was so interested in the interview with Aaron Rodgers. And they talked about all these weird things. I've talked about this before. They talked about trying the Impossible Burger and what Aaron Rodgers thought of that. And this was a few years ago, so most people hadn't tried that yet. And so then suddenly I was like, oh, this Pete Holmes guy is pretty interesting. And I ended up getting into the show. But that wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for getting the specific episode recommendation. So the way that we address these two problems with the launch yesterday is, number one, the same way you would get recommendations for articles to read through Discover, which is like the Google feed of articles, or through Google News. Also, your Google profile is taken into account when you first use Google Podcasts to try to connect you with podcasts that you'll like, even if you don't have a listening history already. And then the second piece of it is that we go straight to the episode. So we actually recommend specific episodes that we think you'll like.
Nice.
And that, I think, is a really good gateway to figuring out if you want to listen to a show. Whereas the prevailing paradigm before yesterday, I think, is that you would start from the most recent episode or the oldest episode. And that's not always the best episode to start with for each person. It's a much more personal problem.
Yeah, so I really like that, and to have it go to a specific episode is really nice. And I guess that's one of the questions I'm curious about. Does the discovery feature sort of improve over time in a way that it can continue to recommend, specific episodes based on, am I getting a better discover feature over time versus what it initially learns about me?
Yes. So the component that we talked about at the beginning, which is your listening history, is another component. And I think, while your interests are a great signal for what podcasts you want to listen to, there's not always a perfect overlap. To give you an example, I really like to listen to podcasts about sports, but I wouldn't necessarily say that in general, I want all my other content to be about sports also. So what happens for me when I'm a new user is I actually get suggested a lot of stuff that's about coding and programming. And this makes sense because that's what I'm into more generally. But oftentimes I like to use podcasts actually to take a break from that. And maybe if I'm going on a run or cooking and just zoning out for a bit. And so as you listen to more podcasts in the app, it'll be much more contextual for what you actually want for podcasts. Whereas the best guess when you just first start is going to be a little more generalized. So the short answer I would say is we try to do the best job we can when you don't have a rich listening history, but we also try to improve as you develop one.
One of the cool features that we see is being able to do Google searches, and you can, ask a question or look up a topic, and it will now start to take you directly to a point in a YouTube video where they talk about that specific thing. So it's sort of doing transcription and lets you do searches that way. Is this something that we'll see in Google Podcasts as well?
That's a really good point, and an interesting observation. So it's useful in YouTube. The one that I've used the most often is how to tie a bow tie. I think the last few times I finally graduated to like the static image tutorial, whereas I needed like the full video.
Right.
But that one like jumps you to a specific point in the video where it's most useful to you. And that's definitely something that I think would be really useful to bring to podcasting as well. And one thing that's important to highlight there is that process requires a lot of input from publishers. So as we develop more of these features that take the technology to the next level, we're also talking a lot with publishers and working with them to make sure that we're doing it mindful of the way that they've artfully constructed their content, the way that they sustain a business with their listeners and their long-term goals. So I think it's similar to YouTube in terms of some of the use cases that we can have, but also a situation where in the open ecosystem of podcasts, we want to make sure that we're proceeding at the right pace and working with publishers closely to build features that are great for users and also great for publishers, because you really need both in order to take the ecosystem to the next level and sustain the growth that we've been so delighted to see over the past few years.
Absolutely. Does Google Podcasts on either platform have an import feature? A lot of people, will be coming from other apps, other podcast apps and things like that, and may want to try this out. Is this a situation where you will just go and find the podcast that you like and subscribe? Or is there some sort of import feature of the list of podcasts that you listen to in other apps?
So our goal since the beginning has been to introduce hundreds of millions of people around the world to podcasts. And we recognize that the vast majority of those people will not have listened to podcasts before. And so we've thought a little bit less about the experience of switching from an app. And I think yesterday when we launched on iOS, it actually forces us to think a little bit more about that switching experience, because podcasts are a little bit more prevalent on iPhone in terms of the percentage of users who are listening to podcasts. And so we want to make that switching process as easily as possible for people who want to switch. But we're always still going to be focused on users who we can introduce to podcasts and where we can really grow the pie in general. So the short answer to your question is we don't currently have an import feature within the app. What I've found since I've set up a lot of new accounts over the past few months is that the other feature that we have launching this week is the ability to subscribe and manage your subscriptions on the web. And I found that compared to the OPML export, OPML import flow in a lot of apps, it's pretty similarly time consuming if you have, less than 100 subscriptions. Maybe it's more like less than 30 to just search on podcast.google.com for the name of the podcast and then subscribe. And that takes, less than 5-10 seconds per podcast if you have the list in front of you. So if you have, 100 podcasts, you're talking about a little less than 10 minutes probably, which sounds like not that much time when I say it, but I also know as a user that it feels really annoying to have to do things manually. So I'm not trying to make excuses. And I wish actually that there was an even more seamless way to switch between apps than OPML, which I think is somewhat difficult.
Right. It's complicated. Yeah.
And also it's not friendly to people who aren't really tech savvy. So one idea I've had that I've been plugging a lot internally, maybe plugging it externally will help us actually build it, is what we should do is, maybe someone else will do it too. That would be cool as well. But hopefully this lights a little bit of a fire. We should be able to import based on any screenshot of cover art. So you can just like go to your library, take a screenshot, go to another app, upload the photo. So I only mention that to say that we've been thinking about it a lot and how to make it more approachable for newer users. And we want to see the industry move forward in general, make it easy for users to choose where they prefer to listen across their devices.
Yeah, that's a wonderful idea. Just the thought of, okay, I go into my my Apple Podcasts library where I can see all the different little squares. I take a screenshot and then that uploads into the Google Podcasts and can automatically subscribe. I will say, though, as I'm doing this, I'm finding it handy to be able to prune my very long list of podcast subscriptions down to ones that I actually want to listen to. So there is a little bit of a benefit to doing that manually that I was not expecting. So that's kind of fun. I do appreciate that.
There's another thing that kind of gets into one of the principles of our product that I feel comfortable saying is a long-term principle, which is in podcasting, if you have like 200 subscriptions, it starts to feel like you're managing it and like it's a lot to manage. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at the way that we've designed the app as of yesterday, what you'll see is that it's designed around making it so that there's never an increased management cost for you because you subscribe to an additional podcast. And if you think about the way you use Twitter or Instagram or YouTube, if you follow 1,000 people or 10,000 people, that doesn't make the experience more clunky and harder to manage. And so we're trying to bring that same level of flexibility to the podcast app because I think most podcast apps right now, they feel best when you have between maybe 10 and 50 subscriptions, but they start to get unwieldy after that. And we've seen such an explosion in the number, variety, and quality of podcasts available over the last 5 years that we don't want you to have to think, oh, do I have too many subscriptions? We want to manage that smartly for you and help you find the content you love most as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I have one final question for you. I know we got to let you go. A lot of folks right now are sort of focusing more time. They're spending more time at home. They're spending more time away and are not necessarily doing the commute that tends to be the standard method of for at least folks that I know, their podcast listening. And so I'm curious, as a person who's steeped in podcasting in general, and as you in your blog post, you shared about how you have found podcasts in the past and looked to podcasts. What does the current state of sort of podcast listening look like in your mind? How are we listening, and where are we listening? And maybe if you want to give us a little glimpse into your life, how and where are you listening to podcasts?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the blog post because writing that, I got into podcasts while I was in my car, like originally, but then thinking about the activities today that are best suited for podcasts, going to the gym is not something that we're really doing anymore, but cooking dinner might be. And it depends where you are, but going on a run is something that you can still do. And so it's been pretty interesting to see when people are turning to podcasts and how they're turning to podcasts in these strange times. And one thing that's true that a lot of people, I think, don't know is that most podcast listening, or at least the plurality of podcast listening, was already taking place at home. So there is a pretty big base there. And I think what we've seen is obviously a decrease in podcast listening during commutes, since people aren't really commuting, at least, people who aren't going into work are not commuting. And some level of increase in terms of interest in the news, interest in finding authoritative content about what's going on with COVID-19. And so I think we feel a sense of responsibility there in a couple ways. Number one is for people who are interested in finding authoritative, relevant, informative podcasts about what's going on in the world. We want to help them stay informed. And I think you'll see that in the product. And then also for probably a majority of people who actually want to use podcasts as a little bit of an escape, because I think there's a mental health crisis that is not of the magnitude of the public health crisis that we have right now, but is still worth taking very seriously. We want to be able to give them a way to just, spend 30 minutes, spend an hour doing something that was normal before the past month, or in certain parts of the world, the past few months. And so that sense of responsibility, I think, also makes us passionate about getting the new Redesign out the door, getting the app out the door on iOS, and just having podcasts available to people. One example for me is I often fall asleep with a podcast on. If I'm reading a book, that's a nice way to fall asleep. And you can kind of turn out the lights in a way where I have to keep a light on if I read a book. So that's something that I've been doing where, maybe before I would listen to a particular podcast while commuting, and now I save it for right before bed. What about you? I'm curious your behavior as well.
Yeah. So I was the right before bed thing. Definitely. I routinely fall asleep to podcasts and then sort of pick them up where I left off in the morning, finish them out while I'm getting ready in the morning. Showers. Another great time. I'm sort of a connoisseur of fine Bluetooth waterproof speakers because I love to listen to music and podcasts in the shower, and walking the dog and things like walking the dogs rather, and things like that. So yeah, there are plenty of places to still listen to podcasts. And for the folks who are listening to this one, listening to this great interview we've had with you, I'm sure they've got just as many fun places to listen to shows. And like you said, whether you're finding an escape or you are looking for authoritative information, podcasts can be great for that.